My name is Margaret Voss, and I was 66 years old the morning I found survey stakes on my own driveway. Not Carol Ann's driveway. Mine. I want to tell you the worst part up front, because you're going to think you know where this story goes, and you don't. The worst part wasn't that my best friend of 20 years had been buying land behind my back. The worst part was that she'd been drinking coffee at my kitchen table the entire time, complimenting my roses, while she quietly closed on the parcel that controlled the only road to my house. I promise you it ends well. It just doesn't end the way anyone at that table expected. I spent 31 years as a licensed land surveyor and appraiser for the county. Boundary disputes. Easement records. Right-of-way filings. Deeds so old the ink had gone the color of tea. People think that job is dull. It isn't. A property line is just a promise written down so two neighbors don't have to fight about it later. I read those promises for a living, and I was good at it. Very good. Good enough that when I retired at 61, 3 different firms tried to keep me on as a consultant. I said no. I wanted my garden. I wanted my 40 acres at the end of Larkspur Hollow Road, the land my husband Walter and I bought in 1994 back when nobody wanted it, back when it was just scrub pine and a creek and a view of the ridge that made your chest hurt a little, in the good way. Walter passed 9 years ago. Heart, sudden, no warning. After that, Carol Ann Pruitt became the center of my week. She lived on the neighboring parcel, a smaller lot that butted up against mine along the north fence line. We met the year Walter and I moved in. She brought over a peach cobbler in a dish she never asked back for, which I've since learned is either genuine kindness or the oldest trick in the book. For 20 years, every Tuesday, rain or shine, Carol Ann came up my driveway at 10 in the morning with a thermos of coffee and sat on my porch. We had a whole ritual. 2 mismatched mugs. Mine had a chip on the handle. Hers had a painted bluebird that had mostly worn off. She'd tell me about her daughter Whitney. I'd tell her about my roses. We'd watch the hawks work the thermals over the ridge and not say much at all, which is its own kind of friendship, the kind where silence doesn't feel like something you have to fill. I trusted her the way you trust a load-bearing wall. Not because you examine it every day. Because you've stopped thinking about it at all. That's important. Hold on to that. Because a load-bearing wall is exactly the kind of thing you don't notice being quietly hollowed out from the inside. It started small, the way these things do. 3 years ago, the Kowalski place, 40 acres directly east of me, went up for sale. I thought about buying it myself, honestly, just to keep the land whole and keep out anyone who'd want to subdivide it. Carol Ann told me not to bother. Some development group already made an offer, she said, stirring her coffee. You don't want to get into a bidding war with people like that, Margaret. Save your money. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? 18 months ago, the Hargrove parcel to the south sold too. I found out from the assessor's newsletter, a little one-line notice buried in the back. Carol Ann shrugged it off the same way. Some LLC, she said. You know how it is now. Nobody sells to a person anymore. It's all shell companies and investors. Both times, I felt that small cold drop in my stomach, the one you get when something doesn't quite line up but you can't say why. If you've ever had a friend explain away something that should have alarmed you, and you let it go because you loved her, you already know that feeling. Type "I know that feeling" in the comments, because we're about to need it. I let it go both times. I had spent 31 years reading land records for strangers. It never once occurred to me to read them for my own neighborhood. That's the thing about trust. It doesn't just blind you to lies. It blinds you to the one skill you actually have that would have caught them in 5 minutes. Then, 6 weeks ago, the county sent a courtesy notice to every property owner on Larkspur Hollow Road. A road maintenance and easement review, standard procedure, nothing dramatic, the kind of letter I used to draft myself back when I worked there. I almost didn't read it. I'm glad I did. Buried in paragraph 3 was a sentence that made me set my coffee down slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid you might drop. The board notes that the sole recorded ingress-egress easement serving parcel 14-220-006, Boss, crosses parcel 14-220-011, currently held by Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC. Bluebird Ridge. The bird on Carol Ann's chipped coffee mug. I read that sentence 4 times before I understood what it was telling me. Someone had bought the parcel that held the only legal road to my house. And they'd named their little company after a bird my best friend kept painted on a mug she'd been drinking from at my table for 20 years. I want you to understand something about a woman who spent 3 decades reading deeds for a living. I don't panic. I verify. That evening, I sat down at Walter's old desk with my laptop, my reading glasses, and a legal pad, and I did to my own neighborhood exactly what I used to do for strangers who thought their fence was 2 feet onto someone else's land. I pulled the county GIS parcel map first. Then I started pulling deeds. One by one. The Kowalski Place, 40 acres, sold 3 years ago. Grantee, Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC. The Hargrove parcel, 62 acres, sold 18 months ago. Grantee, Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC. A smaller 10-acre strip along the creek, sold 9 months ago, one I hadn't even noticed change hands. Grantee, Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC. And finally, the one from the county letter, 14 acres carrying the only recorded access easement to my property, sold 4 months ago. Grantee, Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC. 4 parcels. 3 years. 1 name. I sat very still for a long moment. I did not cry. I pulled up the Secretary of State's business filing database next, the way I'd pulled 1,000 filings before for other people's problems, never once imagining I'd be pulling one for mine. Registered Agent, Whitney Pruitt Dane. Carol Ann's daughter. Managing Member, Carol Ann Pruitt. There it was. Not a stranger's development group. Not some faceless investor. My best friend of 20 years, listed in black and white as the sole managing member of the company that now owned every road, every acre, every point of access surrounding my 40 acres. If you've ever pulled the thread on something and felt the whole sweater start to come apart in your hands, you know exactly the moment I'm describing. Tell me in the comments if you've been there, and stay with me, because it gets worse before it gets better. I spent the next 4 days doing what I do best. Layer by layer. First, the money. County records showed all 4 purchases were cash, no mortgage recorded, which meant no bank had ever asked Bluebird Ridge Holdings a single question about its plans. Total spent across 4 parcels, $340,000. Carol Ann had told me, more than once, over coffee, that she and her late husband had just enough to get by. Then, the small thing that didn't add up. I noticed the LLC's registered address wasn't Carol Ann's house. It was Whitney's husband's office. Grant Dane. Commercial real estate developer, 38 years old, the kind of man who wears a quarter zip to a barbecue. I'd met him twice. Both times he'd asked, almost offhand, whether I'd ever considered what 40 acres like this could really become. I'd laughed it off as small talk. It wasn't small talk. Then, the discovery that turned my stomach cold. I called an old colleague, Deb Marsh, who still works the recorder's office, and asked her, casual as anything, whether Bluebird Ridge had filed anything else recently. She went quiet on the phone for a second. Margaret, she said, there's a preliminary plat submission. Filed 6 weeks ago. 42-lot subdivision, working name Ridgeview Estates. It shows your parcel, the Voss parcel, folded into the site plan as Future Phase 2. Future Phase 2. My home. My 40 acres. Walter's ashes scattered under the oak by the creek. Folded into somebody's Phase 2 like a line item. They can't build without your access easement running through their new lots the way it's laid out, Deb told me. And they can't cleanly develop around a landlocked 40 acres sitting in the middle of their subdivision either. Margaret, whoever's behind this needs you to sell. They've spent $340,000 making sure you eventually will. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Not the money. Not even the land, exactly. The 20 years. Every Tuesday. Every mug of coffee. Every time she'd asked about my knees, my garden, whether I was eating enough since Walter passed. I went back through every one of those conversations in my mind, and I could feel, retroactively, which ones had been friendship, and which ones had been reconnaissance. There was a second CTA I want to put right here, because this is the part people always write to me about later. If you've ever had to go back through years of memories and relabel half of them, comment relabeling below, because I promise you're not the only one, and I promise it does get easier once you know the truth. One more piece, and this was the one that finally steadied my hands instead of shaking them. I went out to the garage and dug through Walter's old filing box, the accordion folder he kept everything important in, labeled in his terrible handwriting. In 1994, when we bought the land, the seller's family had insisted on a formal, recorded ingress-egress easement across what was then the Hargrove parcel, because there was no other legal way in or out. Walter, careful as always, hadn't trusted a handshake. He'd paid an attorney $40 extra to have it recorded permanently at the courthouse, running with the land, binding on all future owners forever, no expiration, no renegotiation. Bluebird Ridge Holdings didn't just own the parcel my easement crossed. They owned it subject to an easement my husband had the foresight to lock in place 3 decades before Carol and ever painted a bluebird on a coffee mug. They could landlock the rest of the world. They could never landlock me. I sat in that garage holding a 30-year-old piece of paper, and for the first time since reading that county letter, I laughed. Quietly. Just once. Then I got up, and I got to work. I didn't call Carol Ann. Not yet. I called Estelle Marchetti, an attorney I'd worked alongside for a decade back when I was still testifying in boundary disputes, the kind of lawyer who reads a deed the way most people read a grocery list, fast and without missing a comma. I laid it all out for her. The 4 parcels. The LLC. Whitney's husband's office address. The preliminary plat with my land folded into Phase 2. Estelle was quiet for a moment. Margaret, she finally said, you have a permanent, recorded, appurtenant easement that predates every single one of their purchases by 30 years. Nothing they've bought changes that. Nothing they've filed changes that. You are, legally, in the strongest possible position a landowner can be in. I know, I said. I want to be sure they know it too. In front of the right people. There's a public county planning commission meeting every month, open to residents, where preliminary plats like Ridgeview Estates get their first formal review. Anyone can speak. Anyone can submit documents into the public record. Carol Ann's plat was on the agenda for the following Thursday. I'll admit, there was a night, 2 days before, when I almost picked up the phone and called her instead. Quietly. Privately. Give her the chance to explain herself somewhere that wasn't a folding chair in a municipal building under fluorescent lights. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. 20 years is not nothing. But I thought about Whitney's husband asking, twice, at a barbecue, what my land could really become. I thought about the mug with the bird on it. I thought about my 40 acres reduced to the phrase future Phase 2 in someone else's blueprint. I put the phone down. Some conversations deserve privacy. This one had been planned in public, on paper, filed with the county for anyone to read. It could be answered the same way. The County Planning Commission meets in a beige room with folding chairs and bad coffee, and I want you to picture that room, because it matters that this happens somewhere ordinary. No ballroom. No white tablecloths. Just fluorescent lights and 40 residents and a 5-person board behind a long table. I got there early and sat in the 3rd row. Carol Ann arrived with Whitney and Grant, and I watched her spot me across the room. Something flickered across her face, quick, gone before most people would have caught it. I'd spent 31 years watching people's faces when they realized a survey didn't say what they wanted it to say. I knew exactly what I was looking at. When Ridgeview Estates came up on the agenda, Grant Dane stood at the podium in a gray suit and gave a smooth, rehearsed presentation. 42 lots. Walking trails. A community-oriented development that would honor the rural character of the area. He clicked to a site map. My 40 acres sat right there on the screen, shaded the same soft green as the future phases, labeled simply Parcel 006, Anticipated Acquisition. Anticipated. As if I were a line item waiting to be checked off. Carol Ann sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, nodding along, the same steady, trustworthy nod she'd given me every Tuesday for 20 years across a chipped mug and a bluebird mug. I put on my reading glasses. The same pair I'd worn to 100 boundary hearings. Old habit. New purpose. When the chair opened the floor for public comment, I stood up. I walked to the podium slowly, the way you walk when you've already decided you have all the time in the world, because you're not the one who needs to be afraid tonight. My name is Margaret Voss, I said. I own Parcel 006, the one labeled on that map as an anticipated acquisition. A ripple went through the room. Grant's jaw tightened. I'd like to submit 3 documents into the public record. I set them down one at a time on the podium, and I read from each, calm, even, unhurried. Document 1. County Recorder filing showing that Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC acquired 4 adjoining parcels over the last 3 years. Purchase price, $340,000, cash, no financing recorded. Document 2. Secretary of State business filing for Bluebird Ridge Holdings LLC, listing Carol Ann Pruitt as managing member and Whitney Pruitt Dane as registered agent. I let that sit a moment. In the front row, I saw Whitney's hand find her husband's sleeve. Document 3. A recorded ingress-egress easement, dated 1994, granted to my late husband Walter Voss and running with the land in perpetuity, crossing what is now Parcel 011, held by Bluebird Ridge Holdings. I looked up from the page. This board is being asked to approve a 42-lot subdivision that depends on folding my land into its footprint, I said. I want the record to show, plainly, that my land is not for sale, that it cannot be legally landlocked, and that any development plan drawn without my easement running exactly where it has run for 30 years is not a plan. It's a hope. Somewhere behind me, a woman I didn't recognize spoke up from the back row. I'm Deb Marsh, I work in the recorder's office, she said, standing. I can confirm every document Mrs. Voss just read is accurate and on file. Nobody had asked her to be there. She'd come anyway. Grant Dane tried to recover, something about still finalizing acquisition conversations, but his voice had lost its polish, and everyone in that room could hear it fraying at the edges. Carol Ann didn't try to speak at all. She just sat there, very still, the way I imagine I looked the night I read that letter at my kitchen table. I gathered my papers. Carol Ann, I said, quiet enough that it was only for her, though the room had gone silent enough to carry it anyway, 20 years of Tuesdays, and you never once told me you needed my address more than you needed my friendship. I didn't wait for an answer. I walked back to my seat, sat down, and folded my hands in my lap, exactly the way she used to. The commission tabled the Ridgeview Estates application indefinitely that same night, pending resolution of access issues, which is the polite municipal way of saying the whole thing was dead on arrival. Grant Dane's firm quietly walked away from the project within 3 weeks. I heard, secondhand, that he'd personally guaranteed part of the acquisition costs to investors, and that walking away cost him more than money. I take no pleasure in that, and I take no pleasure in pretending I don't understand why he tried. Development is his business. He saw 40 beautiful acres and a road nobody had thought to lock down. Men like that see opportunity the way I see property lines. It's just what their eyes are trained to do. That doesn't make it right. It does make it human. Whitney called me once, about a month later. She didn't ask for anything. She said she was sorry, that she'd gone along because her mother told her it was just business, and that she hadn't let herself think too hard about whose kitchen table that business had been planned across. I believe her, mostly. Sometimes people would rather not look too closely at a plan when looking closely would mean stopping it. Carol Ann sold 2 of the 4 parcels back onto the open market within the year, at a loss. The Kowalski place went to a young family who wanted horses. I introduced myself the week they moved in. Good people. She kept the parcel that carries my easement. She's welcome to it. It's worth considerably less now that everyone in the county recorder's office, and frankly everyone at that planning meeting, understands exactly what runs through the middle of it, forever, no expiration. We don't speak anymore. There was no scene, no slammed door, no shouting. Just Tuesday mornings that stopped happening, the way a clock stops when nobody wins it. I still see her car sometimes, at the far end of the road. She still lives there. We are, in the strictest legal sense, still neighbors. We are not, in any sense that matters, still friends. I gave the Bluebird mug to Deb Marsh, actually. She laughed when I explained why. It sits on a shelf in her office now, a strange little trophy for honesty. I bought my own reading glasses a new case, if you're wondering about symbolism. The old one had a hairline crack I'd never gotten around to fixing. Some things you finally have the clarity to replace once you've used them for what they were really for. I still sit on my porch most mornings. The view of the ridge hasn't changed. The hawks still work the thermals the same lazy circles they always have. The creek still runs the same line it's run since before either Carol and or I ever set foot on this road. I make 1 mug of coffee now instead of 2. I've made peace with that. Some Tuesdays are for company, and some Tuesdays are just for the quiet, and I've learned, at 66, that both kinds are worth having. Here's what I want you to carry away from this, if you carry away nothing else. Trust is not the same thing as blindness. Love someone for 20 years if you're lucky enough to get 20 years. Bring them coffee. Ask about their knees. But keep your eyes open enough to read your own paperwork every so often, because the people closest to you have the clearest view of exactly where your fences are thin. I spent 31 years protecting other people's property lines. It took 1 letter from the county to remind me I still had to protect my own. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever discovered that someone you trusted had quietly been circling something of yours, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories about women who were counted out and counted wrong, subscribe and stay a while. There's always another Tuesday coming. I intend to spend mine exactly where I am.